Hi everyone, this is Yana, and in this video I'm sharing a card with the stamped bokeh effect. In photography, bokeh effect refers to a form of a blur. Simply put, it's those translucent circles that you see in photographs in the background. They make pictures more appealing to the eye as they focus our attention on a particular area of the image. The word bokeh comes from Japanese language, which literally translates as blur. So today we're going to create this blur effect using stamps, pigment and dye inks, and some paper. This might seem intimidating and difficult, but in fact it's a very fun technique. So I'm going to start working on a piece of white cardstock. To do my stamping, I'm going to use these two clear stamp sets from Hero Arts. One with the sentiments called Be Happy Today, and another one with circles called Circles. You can also create this look with the help of a stencil, but I simply love playing with stamps more than I love with stencils, so I'm going to use these stamps from Hero Arts today. The key to create a bokeh effect is using various types of inks. Some that would dry on top of the paper, like pigment inks, and some that would go inside the paper, like dye inks, and maybe something in between, like chalk inks. I will be using pigment inks to do most of the stamping, and then we'll come in with some dye and chalk inks to finish my card. Now there are two ways we can go about creating a card with a bokeh effect. We can either stamp a bokeh effect first and add a sentiment, and then add a sentiment. This way it's going to look a bit more vivid. Or you can stamp a sentiment first and then create a bokeh effect on top of it. This way your sentiment is going to be partially covered with semi-translucent circles. I like the second way better, so this is what I'm going to do today. But either way will work great, and you will end up having a beautiful bokeh background. I'm going to start by stamping this No Dream Is Ever Too Big sentiment using VersaFine Onyx black ink. I'm using a clear block with grid lines as I find this helps me to stamp things straight and have them centered. It's a bit more difficult to do with the regular block, the one that doesn't have grid lines on it. But it's manageable. I'm going to stamp the sentiment towards the bottom of my card. Now I'm moving on to creating a bokeh effect. I suggest using various diameter circle stamps and begin stamping with the largest. Another trick is to use lighter colors of ink for your larger stamps and then move on to darker colors of ink for your smaller diameter circles. So I'm going to stamp the first circle slightly overlapping the sentiment. Notice that some ink from the sentiment transferred onto my stamp. This might not happen with the inks you're using, but this always happens with the ones that I use. And I've tried this technique with pigment and dye inks from Clear Snap, and also with some dye inks from Hero Arts. So if it does transfer, make sure to clean your stamps before stamping it again, as you will end up stamping that partial sentiment somewhere on your card and will probably ruin it. Once I've cleaned your stamp, I'm going to go ahead and ink it again with the same color of ink and stamp again. And then one last time to create a visual triangle around the sentiment. So see, this is why I like to stamp my sentiment first and then do a background around it. Move on to the next light color of ink and repeat your stamping. Remember to clean your stamp from that partial sentiment ink transfer to keep your background clean from additional colors. I've only stamped the second colored circle twice and ended up having 5 circles on my background. It's always best to keep the number of elements to an odd number like 3 or 5 or 7 and so on. I will however come back to this larger circle stamp again later and will add more circles, but they will be a lot less visible. For the moment, I felt that I had enough large circles on my background. I then moved to a second image, which is the smaller circle from the circle stamp from Hero Arts, and I grabbed the splash chalk ink from Clear Snap to do my stamping. I could have continued using pigment inks for this, but I simply did not have the color of ink that I wanted to use in a pigment form. So I inked my stamp and started stamping around the sentiment, overlapping it again. Remember to clean your stamp from the ink transfer from the sentiment every time you stamp on top of it. From that moment on, I basically moved in a random fashion. I kept inking my stamp and stamping it in any white areas that I had on my card. After I've stamped 5 circles, notice that it's an odd number again. I moved on to a different color, but I kept using the same stamp. I added 2 more stamp circles and ended up having 7 of this diameter on the card. Notice that I'm also overlapping almost all of the circles on my card. I'm intentionally stamping them partially on top of the previously stamped images to create a more realistic bokeh effect. Moving on to a smaller image. This time I'm going to use a bit darker color of ink. I would not recommend using darker colors for larger circles as they might make your background look too busy. And we really don't want that. We want to create a light feel to our card. So next I switched to the second smallest stamp in the set and chose to use a bit more vibrant ink. And again, I'm randomly stamping circles on my background. Remember to clean your stamp if you stamp on top of the sentiment. Finally, for the smallest stamp, I'm using the darkest color of ink, and I'm also using dye ink for this. Before I was using mostly pigment inks. I'm starting by stamping a visual triangle around the sentiment and then moving on to other areas of the background. I also felt I needed to add a few more larger circles in that dark blue color, so I grabbed my stamp, a larger one, and stamped a few more onto my background. After it was done, I still had some pretty large unstamped areas on my card. To fill those in, I grabbed the largest stamp and a bit of a light gray pigment ink from Clear Snap. I added a very thin, light layer of ink to my stamp. Notice that I'm not applying very much pressure when inking the stamp and therefore end up having a very, very thin layer of ink. When stamped, it's almost not going to show through. At this point, our background is pretty much done. We have a nice bokeh area around the sentiment with semi-translucent and translucent circles. However, if we want to spice it up a bit, or if we have any other unstamped areas or any messy areas, we can add texture paste to our background and some circular embellishments like sequins, enamel dots, gems, or pearls. I'm no pro when it comes to embossing paste. I just recently got my first bottle of this stuff, so I won't be able to give you any tips on how you can use it, but I will show you how I added a few raised areas to my background. I'm going to use the circle stencil from Clear Snap and tape it down with some washi tape. You can use painter's tape or a post-it note. You just need something to hold it in place. The washi tape that I'm using is from Tim Holtz, and I love using it for things like this because it's very low tech. I've never had a problem with it. It never ripped or damaged paper. I'm going to add a very, very thin layer of embossing paste. I want it to be semi-translucent. You can add a bit more thicker layer if you want, but I wanted to have these semi-translucent circles on top of my background, so I was going with a very thin layer. You do need to set this aside to dry for some time. It doesn't take that long, but it's best to let it air dry. After it was dry, I added some double-sided tape to the back of the background and then adhered it to an A2 top folding card. I then moved to embellishing my cards and added just a few sequins here and there and finished my project. So here's another card that I did using the same technique. I added some gold embossing powder to the texture paste while it was wet. It's a neat trick that I learned from Jennifer McGuire. So this is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you're looking for a list of products I used to create this card, you can find it below in the video description or on my blog. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please click that like button and be sure to share it with your crafty friends. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.